this is obviously a session which has been called anti-doping and cycling working here. And I think it's a reality, but an unfortunate one, is that when we talk about the science of cycling, this word will come up, this doping question. And it's going to come up again, I think, in many times in the next few weeks. And what the Congress have done, I think, is put together a panel which covers all the bases, ticks all the boxes, in terms of getting perspectives from the relevant stakeholders. And so I'm going to introduce very quickly, because I know I'm eating into their time and your question time. From my closest to me is Dr. Olaf Schumacher, who's currently at Aspertar. He's just given a presentation on the biological passport and some of the scientific concepts behind it, the challenges that it faces, and where to next. And so he can talk from the science perspective. On his right is Marco Pinoti, former elite cyclist himself, who goes by the Cycling Professor, a book that he's written, and one of the more cerebral cyclists in the peloton, I think, and a man who has, over the last 15 years career, since 1999 up to retirement in 2014, has seen both sides of the equation, the doping question. So we'll get his perspectives from the peloton. On his right is Professor Mario Zorzoli, who is the Chief Medical Officer of the UCI, the International Cycling Union, and also serves as the chairman of the ASOIF, which is the Association of Summer Olympic Federation Medical Consultative Group. So someone who can speak from the policy side of it. And then last but not least, on the far side is Michael Hutchinson, who is a former cyclist, an elite. In fact, if you look him up on Wikipedia, you'll see quite a list of records and achievements, but now covers the sport from the journalist point of view, and has written a couple of books, one on the 1 hour record, which I think is something of an autobiographical book, and most recently a book this year called Faster, the Obsession, Science and Luck Behind the World's Fastest Cyclists. And so we've got journalists, we've got policy makers, medical doctors, former cyclists, team physicians, and yourselves to ask questions as much as possible. So I want to kick off and then as soon as possible get out the way so that you can ask questions. And I think it's important, certainly for me, that this is a discussion that's been had so often, and we have to find not new things for the sake of being new, but I want to try and dig into things that maybe you won't typically see, and so these experts are available to do that. And I want to start by reading a quote, and I want to ask Marco this to begin with. This happens every few years, and it's normally the same guy. There's an Oxford professor, Julian Savulescu, who a few weeks ago was quoted as saying the following: "Anti-doping has failed, it's time to allow drugs in sport." And there have been a number of articles, he's written a number of papers on this as well. But the crux of the argument is as follows. When the EPO test was introduced in the early 2000s, there were claims this would eradicate doping, but over the last 12 years that I've been looking at this, the pattern just hasn't changed. So that's where it begins, and it ends with this conclusion that we cannot win the fight against doping. Anti-doping has failed, and so therefore it's time to allow drugs in sport. So let's start with the cyclist. Is why are we even having this discussion? Why should we not agree with that and not have this talk and say let the best doper win?
So, for me, this is not even an issue, because the goal of the anti-doping is to protect the rights of the clean athletes and to let them fulfill their dreams when they're young. When you start a sport, you do it because you enjoy it, and eventually you want to achieve your potential. And if there is no fight against doping, then you have people taking shortcuts. First of all, it's not lessons. It's not a good lesson to learn to the kids. And then it is just not right. And then what this person has said is not true at all, because from the introduction of the EPO test, from the introduction of the biological passport, I can talk for the sport of cycling. Regardless of what the general perception is, there has been a change in how doping is spread. And in my opinion, it became from a pathological levels, which was maybe in the late 90s or in the early 2000 year, to I would say, physiological level. Of course, there will never be a 0% doping athlete group, but of course there will always be people looking for the small edges, but we went from EPO to microdoses, but like I say, microdoses develop, they give you micro effects. So a natural talent with training can now win races and fulfill his potential, achieve his dreams clean, and that's a big difference. For me, it's not what these people say. I can say it's bullshit.
Beautifully put. Let's go from inside the sport, and in actual fact it's not true, because we're not going outside it. If I come to you, Michael, and ask you, now that you're covering the sport from the media perspective, what's your perception of this kind of debate around the doping and the fact that the sport seems to be tarnished and is pulling back? Where do you see it going?
In terms of whether we continue a fight against doping or whether we admit defeat on that, or?
Yeah, almost in that fatalistic sense that people are saying that, and we seem to almost be a little bit...
I think one of the issues is that media coverage of the sport by its nature tends to separate elite sport from other sport. There is sport that is in the paper and there is sport that is in television that doesn't appear connected to other sport. And the issue with something like saying, let's allow doping in cycling, let the best doper win, is at what point does that kick in? Does that work its way all the way down to a 10-year-old taking up cycling for the first time? I mean, there's got to be a break-off point. Or do you simply say that we have doping for all ages, all genders, all aspects of sport? And I think it's one of the things that the media is not always good at, is connecting a sport together in its entirety.
So then let's, if I mean, just 2 hours ago, as Twitter started buzzing about a South African cyclist who's actually just announced that he failed the test for a substance called probenecid. And a lot of the responses are, well, Si, here we go again. You know, we've seen this, been there, done that. Is the media perpetuating that attitude? I mean, what role does the media play in our attitude towards doping as from within the sport?
Doping is always a story in the media, and it tends to kick in very abruptly because you don't hear any of the context, any of the background. There are things that everyone in the sport, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, has known. Everybody in the media of the sport has known over the last 10 or 15 years that they can't report because of the legal restrictions. So you get someone who actually produces a positive analytical finding, or someone who then is banned. That becomes a very big story. Something like Lance Armstrong is the biggest story in cycling in the last 10 or 15 years. But in a way, that's not always the result of the cycling media. That's a bigger general sports media. It's telling that Lance Armstrong goes and talks to Oprah Winfrey, because suddenly that's a much more general story. And the cycling media is not always in the position it would like to be to put all of that stuff in a context within cycling.
So, Professor Zorzoli, then, I mean, you are, obviously there are certain issues, current doping cases that Professor Zorzoli can't speak to today, but as someone who is the custodian, as it were, for the cycling's governing body, what is your perception of the media, the perception of the sport, the battle that you're trying to fight from within? Because it must be quite challenging, I would imagine, because the default response is to criticize, and you're trying to do, I think in York has shown that there are some good things happening. Your perceptions?
Well, it's a kind of a very difficult perception. For instance, I have difficulties in understanding why a couple of years ago, when in interview the former director of the Cycling and Clean Doping Foundation, Anne Gripper, said that there were 20 or 24 suspicious cases. There were articles all over the net. When athletics publish their results on the prevalence, and they find that in some countries 50% of the athletes are suspicious of doping, there is nothing. I mean, we had 12 passport cases, everyone got big lines in the papers. Athletics had more than 30, and nothing happened. So there is a kind of discrepancy. Nevertheless, I think what is important, and I come back also to what Marco was saying, to rebut what this professor has said, is that we don't have to forget that in the last years, many progresses have been made in the fight against doping. Not only from the analytical point of view, recently, with progresses which have been made in the detection of some drugs, they could catch 80 times more cheaters than in the years before for the same substances, because they could find new metabolites which were long-lasting, but also because of the involvement of, let's say, other sources of like the pharmaceutical companies, with the agreements that WADA have signed with them, so that the anti-doping world can be aware prior to the commercialization of some drug of which drug has the potential to be used as doping, and maybe be able to finalize detection tests prior to that. But more than that is all what is going on with the national agencies, especially in terms of investigation, in terms of sharing information with public authorities, the police, the customs, to the extent that nowadays many national anti-doping organizations have had more than 30 or 40% of the doping cases through these non-analytical cases. So I think that the future of the fight against doping has to be seen under this different perspective. It's not only the urine sample which is positive or negative. We have seen that you are tested 500 times and then you are negative. Marion Jones, it was the same. But we have now different tools, different weapons that we can use. So I think we have to be optimistic.
Let's talk quickly about some of those tools. And Olaf Schumacher has just actually given a talk, but you can see the size of the audience has swelled quite a bit since your presentation on one such tool. So without putting you on the spot to rehash the presentation and repeat it, just introduce very quickly the biological passport concept and what it has done for the sport. And then I want to ask Marco to explain his perceptions of it from the receiving end of the tool.
Well, the biological passport basically does not look for the for forbidden substance itself. It looks for the effect of the substance on certain biomarkers. So basically you analyze certain variables within the body and you check how they have reacted compared to previous values of the same athlete, and then you will discover certain patterns that are typical for doping, and you basically convict an athlete based on that indirect information. And this is currently done with very basic hematological markers, but the path into the future, and I think this is what we're looking at the moment, comprises all this additional information that Mario has mentioned, and all new probably analytical techniques. So it moves more into a forensic way, the stuff that you know from CSI and all these TV shows, where you have different types of information feeding into one case, which will ultimately convict the athlete.
So that passport was introduced. Just give us a little timeline so we can create the context for Marco to talk about his career.
Basically, the passport was introduced in 2008, only in cycling, and now there's about 35 organizations that have it. So organization means like international sporting bodies, national federations. And there's about, all over all of these 35 organizations, about 17,000 tests done a year on 6,000 athletes. So in cycling, to give you a rough overview, an athlete, depending on his degree of suspicion, would probably have anything, and how long he has been in the program, would have anything between 10 and 90 tests in his blood profile.
So let's come to Marco now, because your career obviously started in 1999. That means that we've just heard it would have been 9 years pre-biological passport, then post. Talk a little bit about the impact of the testing, not just biological passport, also EPO was discoverable during your career. Talk a little bit about that and how it would have changed your perceptions as an athlete in the peloton.
When I turned pro in 1999, I was immediately after the Festina affair at the Tour de France. And after that, there's been introduction of the EPO test in 2001, and then the biological passport 2008, and you have in the middle the Puerto case 2006. And every time there is I would say a decrease, in the perception of that there is a decrease in people who look to cheat to improve their performances, because they are actually more scared of the consequences. And so it's only during those years it was a little bit a mix of anti-doping measures and policies, investigation. And I would say, the biggest change came, in my opinion, with the biological passport, because what they've changed a lot was they introduced basically a real out-of-competition testing program, because something that has always been should have always been done, but I never got tested. I never got tested out of competition before 2008, and then from 2008 I got maybe 12 times they have visit from testing commissary, from anti-doping commissary. So the athlete has the perception that when they come at your house that you are always under the radar, and then you really, it becomes part of the routine to fill out the Adams form, and it makes you conscious of that you're always controlled, and that changed a lot about the moral environment in the peloton. And this is show the athlete that they're always making improvement. And I think the anti-doping has to use the asymmetry of information. Like the athletes, when they tested positive, and then maybe they taking only the blood to have the blood parameters, he doesn't know what do they do with this. For example, maybe they can test a new substances. So the more often you get tested out of competition, the less is keen to look for cheating.
So let's Professor Zorzoli, let's talk about, because obviously the passport now is in theory a very effective tool, but we heard a little bit earlier about some of the challenges that it faces. What do you, as the UCI medical director, chief of medical officer, need in order to be able to use this tool more effectively in the future and win the trust back of the people who watch the sport?
Well, I think first of all you have to define what is the efficacy. I mean, how can you look at the efficacy of the biological passport? Personally, I don't think that you can look at it by measuring the number of athletes which have been caught simply on the passport. I believe more on other issues which are related to the passport. First of all, the deterrent effect. As Marco was saying, it is only since the introduction of the passport that effective out-of-competition testing programs took place, so more than 50% of these samples on these athletes are collected out of competition. It is the fact that the passport is something which will follow you. So we encourage teams when they want to hire new athletes to ask the UCI the permission to provide them with the data, because we have seen athletes which have not been hired. We have seen athletes which have not been selected for major competition because of their abnormal passports. And also, it helps you from the perspective of the athlete. Okay, we are talking now about microdoses, the use of different microdoses of different substances, but nevertheless, things have changed to the extent that now an athlete can really ask himself, is it worth taking the risk, knowing that I can be tested out of competition, knowing that I can be under investigation from the police or from other sources, knowing that the effect of the performance might be less than the time when the majority of the tests on Lance Armstrong were done, and so on. So I think this is very important. Now for us is how to better use, as Olaf was saying, the resources. So maybe if we can put in place other module, we have the steroidal module, which to my opinion it will less likely lead to doping case based on the passport, but it will lead anti-doping organization to better target anti-doping, traditional anti-doping tests, for instance with IRMS to detect exogenous testosterone. If we can go into the direction of growth hormone, transfusions. So I think it's just a new possibility that we have to be able to use in the better way in the future, which will help us in really fighting more effectively against the doping.
So one of the problems certainly that I've perceived is that many of the tools, you've spoken about future tools, the steroid passport, the opportunity that we can now look back, and this is obviously a huge deterrent. Marco alluded to, we can look back many years at a time and we can try and discourage doping today on the possibility that it'll be caught. Michael, what is your perception then from the media in terms of what's been spoken about for cycling, to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? We say that from this day forward, not BP, biological passport, everything in the past is gone, everything in the future is treated differently, and we should just move on, because cycling seems to me to be caught in a constant battle of looking backwards and trying to move forwards.
I think from a media point of view, a lot of people would like that simply because it would be a clean sheet, and it's very simple, because one of the difficulties with all doping as presented in the media is that you have to simplify it very considerably. Things like the biological passport are a challenge for the media because it's a complicated way to try and detect doping. So it's anything like that that is very, very simple is hugely appealing, both for the media and both, I think, for the cycling public, the sports public, particularly the sports public that are not specialist cycling fans. It's a simple answer. Whether it's a good answer is an entirely different question. Personally, I suspect it's very difficult, but from a media point of view, yes, it could be quite attractive.
Marco, you're in the sport now, what do you think? You've got all these directors, you've got current cyclists who, if you dug deep enough, and some have been implicated as doping 5-10 years ago, they are likely to continue in the sport. Blank slate, or do we sanction retrospectively from your perspective, from your position?
It's a difficult question to answer because, it's always a matter of balance between what is fair and what is, what is right to look forward or to go backward. Personally, I think that you have to look always in the past, not to make the same mistakes in the future, and you have to pay for the consequences of the choices you made in the past, and then at least sometimes extreme measures are necessary, and so even like in the case of the passport, you have people who have been caught 3-4 years afterwards. I wouldn't want these people to be involved in the sport anymore. So this is a way of looking in the past, but and at the same time looking in the future, looking forward. So that you don't have these people working, at least in the sport anymore. So it's kind of, my opinion is this one, that you don't want. I don't want people who've been cheating in the past being involved in the future. So it's not only just forget about the past. It's also a way to measure in the future.
Let's take some questions from the audience, because I'm sure that there are avenues that I maybe haven't explored enough. Sam is over here. We got the guys with the mics. Can you guys get your shoes on? And while you're getting the mics to the guys with their hands up, Maria's just going to add something. Thanks.
I think that especially with the 2015 World Anti-Doping Code, we also have maybe to start thinking a little bit different in terms of anti-doping and in relation to doping offenses. More and more because of the investigations, more and more because of incentives which are given to license holders which have been found positive to speak out. The fact of the new rule of prohibited association, I think we will have to get a little bit more used to the fact that athletes or doctors or coaches or sports directors can be caught positive in a certain way or confounded of anti-doping rule violation years after what they've done, because it was simply the results of a retesting of a sample, it was simply the results of the conclusion of the passport profiling, it was simply the results of an investigation. So let's start to think of anti-doping not only at the end of the competition when all the tests are done, but maybe take sometimes in our mind the fact that maybe years later some results have
kind of
changed.
then related to that, and I know this is not your position to hand out the sanction, but would you be happy to see a 4-year ban instead of a 2-year or even a life ban for first offence for certain doping offences? Do you think that's even tenable?
Well, I think it was anyhow, it was the will of the entire sport and movement to go into this direction. So I think it's more than appropriate, and it will be for, let's say, hard doping.
Yeah. We've got the mic ready, thanks.
Thank you. I would like to link basically some of the scientific section this morning with this discussion. Basically, regardless of the differences in opinion, what comes out, I guess, in science over the last 15, 20 years is the increasing role of the brain in limiting or regulating endurance performance. And my question is, I think, there may be in the future, or maybe already now, let's call it neurodoping. So doping aimed at modifying brain function, improving performance that way. And there are two challenges, I think. The first one is that monitoring brain function through blood markers is very difficult. So I would like to know what's your opinion on that, and for example, in terms of the biological passport. And the second one, it's a bit more far-fetched question, is this. Most of the time, doping is seen as something you do to improve your own performance. I think, for example, I've just submitted a paper where I show changes in performance based on subconscious visual cues provided to the subject. So, and there's a lot of neuroscience behind this. So I may be able to influence negatively an opponent rather than improving my own performance using knowledge of cognitive neuroscience. Would that be considered doping?
So the first part of the question was how do we deal with doping of the brain and tinkering with the command center, as it were. And then the second part, would Mario be your target for that question on how do we do? And, okay, so Olaf's going to take a crack at both, and then I'm also going to ask Mario to take a go at the second one.
Yeah, well, thanks. Obviously, there's different doping techniques, and that require different detection techniques. I remind you that at the end of last year, I think one substance was put on the list of monitoring substances is a substance that modifies pain perception. You know, the famous tramadol thing. You know, and that goes a little bit into that direction. So I think we have to adapt the techniques to the substances we're looking at. So once certain neurodoping will be more substantial, I think we'll have appropriate ways to address that issue. Which technique is appropriate? Obviously, the biological pathway is probably not the right technique. You know. To the second question, very interesting, but I think it's already happening every day. You know, if you look at the penalty shootouts, you know, there's good scientific studies that the way that the shooter and the goalkeeper actually behave before the actually penalty influences the outcome. And I think that's not doping. I think that's part of the sport. You know, how to impress the opponent, how to scare him off a little bit. And there's many examples in cycling where that has happened. Where, for example, Lance Armstrong, who's constantly present today, I remember Marco was probably there on the day where he basically mimicked some deficiency on the foot of another climb and tried to motivate Jan Ulrich. Basically fell into the trap, and then Lance rode away from him. I think it's just part of the sport and has nothing to do with doping.
But is that what you were alluding to?
Kind of. I think when it's people are aware of these things. For example, that people can disturb you or cheat you by faking that they are fatigued when they're not and stuff. You are aware of it, and so as somebody receiving it, you may be able to, maybe you make the wrong decision, but when it's something is subconscious, you're not aware of what's going on. You don't know.
Sure, but
and I increase your perception of that and reduce your performance by doing things that you're not aware of. I think that's a bit.
Professor Zorzoli, I see, was itching at the mic.
Well, nevertheless, WADA has defined the rules, and to be considered as doping, I mean a prohibited method or substance or behavior, whatever, it has to fulfill 2 of the 3 criteria. And probably this will fulfill only one criteria, which is unfair, unethical, but not dangerous for your health or improving performance, because for the athlete himself who is applying it is not. So still it has to fulfill this criteria. Whatever can fulfill 2 of these criteria has the right to be put on the prohibited list, otherwise not.
Is there a mic at the back? I saw a hand up there. Yes, sir. And then we'll come to Yanis and then David over here. Yes, shoot.
Yeah, I guess my question goes out to Olaf here. this is a bit naive, but if I understood the sessions a little bit before, we were talking about a little bit of a leak in the detection of microdosing and autologous doping. Those were kind of like the difficult areas to detect. This is naive, but how effective are those compared to, let's say, full-out EPO doping to the hematocrit limit? Just, if there is a leak, how effective are those techniques for improving performance?
That depends on the size of the leak. As Marco has put it rightly, microdosing, micro effect, and macrodosing, macro effects. Of course it will have an effect.
What percentage of full out, let's say?
Impossible to say, because the magnitude of the effect of full doping is different in every individual, So EPO will not have the same effect on every individual, or let's say the same dose of EPO will not have the same effect on every individual. So it's very difficult to quantify, but you're speaking performance difference in the top riders of 1% or less. You can obviously imagine that even a small effect of doping will have measurable impact on the outcome, on the result of the race, possibly, yes.
Sorry to interrupt, having said that, Marco alluded earlier, and maybe just pick up on this again, is that you would be happy today knowing that doping is not so decisive to the result that a clean athlete can still win, because that margin of performance improvement is reduced, yes? I mean, at what point do you start to become dissatisfied it's not good enough, as opposed to now we can compete, we're happy?
To give you a real example, a rider should be happy when a competitor maybe tests positive for EPO, and maybe he beat him in the play just while he was using EPO. It means that he was able to beat the guy on EPO even without using it. So there are riders who test positive, who was tested positive last year for EPO, who were competitive but weren't winning all the races. So that means that they were maybe using microdoses, but the effects were not so relevant that they were making them big stars. So that would be, already a good results for the anti-doping.
Yanis, do you have a mic? We go to David first, and then to David.
Yeah, I wanted to see if I could turn the discussion a little bit to the supply chain. And Terrados, Fuentes, Ferrari, we know these people. And I wonder, with these sophisticated doping techniques, does anti-doping move into the realm of deterring the provider? And Olaf, we've been around each other for a number of years and know a lot of these are great people. A lot of them are wonderful people, and somehow they get caught up in pressure and somehow start to act in ways that a lot of us would not appreciate. What do you think, Olaf, about the deterrent?
Sorry, and I'm also going to ask Michael to comment on the same question from the media's perspective, like when you write the story, who's actually guilty? We'll go to Olaf first.
Well, obviously, there's always two sides and more aspects to a doping problem than just the athlete. The athlete is the one who has the Porsche and the fancy girlfriend if he wins the races, that's for sure. But obviously,
I've seen your girlfriend. Your wife, yeah.
Well,
both. I've seen both.
I take this as a compliment. Yes, where were we? So, now, obviously, it's the environment, obviously, where the athlete evolves in, and that comprises obviously doctors, physiotherapists, and the whole, let's say, I would say, mood, and where everything is evolving. And I'm saying Marco can speak much better out of it. And I gave that example at the beginning of my last talk when. Those who weren't here, when I started as a team physician and one of my athletes won a race, and then some doctor of another team asked me, how did you prepare your ride? And I just started to tell him about the intervals we were doing, and he said, no, what medication did you give him? And I was a bit surprised, so this a little bit also depends a little bit on the environment, but at the moment in anti-doping, there's a lot of effort being made to cover that area. Many of the agencies nowadays work together with the customs, for example, and with other sources of information to basically stop that environment and to basically cut it dry. You will be interested to know that, for example, at the customs, at the moment, they seize more anabolic steroids than cocaine, for example, so that number has gone up a lot. And it's one of the main targets in anti-doping, I think, to go down these pathways other than the analytical ones.
Michael, just some perspectives on supply chain versus athlete guilt from the media.
The story normally goes after whoever is the big name, the most famous person that can be dragged into the story. So normally that's the athlete, because it's the athlete that people have heard of. For instance, the doping story that broke this morning about Darrell Impey returning a positive analytical for Fosmigate was literally seconds before people pointed out that he is a former teammate of Chris Froome, because Chris Froome is a much bigger name, and whilst the connection is very tenuous and probably non-existent in terms of a doping issue, it's the biggest name they can drag into it. So it will go after whoever will shift copies, whoever will get clicks on website, whoever sells magazines. One of the things that the media have actually been quite good at more recently is following supply chains and taking an interest in that. David Walsh, for instance, at the Sunday Times, did a very, very good investigative journalism job around Lance Armstrong by following supply chains, by following teammates, by talking to soigneurs, and actually doing a really serious investigation, which is something that the sports media are not always very good at. But in general, the story goes after the most famous person they can drag into them.
Yanis, and then if there are any other questions, we'll take 5 minutes more of these, I think. Yes, we'll go here next.
Okay, I'll comment first on the question. My comment relates to the question that was made before about the centrally acting drugs. And then Olaf saying that maybe the athlete biological passport is not the way to deal with those. I would disagree with that. I think the biological passport is exactly the way to deal with it, because if you look at a non-targeted omics approach, the genes that are being switched on are genes that affect all sorts of different systems, and some of the drugs, let's take EPO, the genes that are being switched on are centrally acting. A lot of them anyway, and EPO, for example, across the blood-brain barrier, and a lot of its effects are central rather than peripheral. So I do think an omics approach is a way to deal with the kind of centrally acting drugs as well as the other drugs. My question relates to using an omics kind of approach, especially as a deterrent, because you can store blood. The whole idea is to be able to store blood for a very long time, and as these approaches being developed, to actually utilize them. But who's going to pay for that? That's really my question, in the sense that currently WIDA is paying for this. These kind of approaches are very expensive to develop. Should some of the sponsors, some of the other organizations involved in the sports, not only cycling, but in other sports, take on some of that burden to resolve those kind of issues? Because I think the technologies and know-how is there. It's purely a financial reason why this is taking so long.
Anyone want to? I guess we go to the UCI first.
No, on its own, UCI has a little bit contributed also to some research in anti-doping. But I think, for instance, after the World Congress in Johannesburg, the new IOC president, Mr. Bach, has said that they would be keen on putting $10 million available for the research in anti-doping. They're still waiting that the governments can match it so that they can pay, because it was the position from the beginning of the IOC, said we match every single dollar which is paid by the government. So if they agree to put a similar fund on it, then it will be 20 million.
Can I ask you a sort of related question? Do you have any idea per dollar spent on the science, the actual testing, how much is spent on the legal side, enforcing? I mean, is there an answer to, am I allowed to ask, are you allowed to disclose that? Is that, because it seems to me to be quite a legislatively costly exercise to actually enforce this tool. It's like you've got this great car, but it costs a lot to run.
To be honest, I have no idea how much does these legal cases cost. What I know is that now more and more we are achieving, and I think another good example is IAAF, achieving in having agreements with the convicted athletes or whatever, the license holders, for a sanction without going to trials. And maybe a way also to decrease this cost in the future will be the new WADA rules, World Anti-Doping Code rule, which says that if there is agreement of all the parties, we can skip the first instance tribunal and go directly to CAS. This will limit probably the cost. But also it depends on how famous is the athlete and things like that. I mean, there are cases which have cost maybe 1 million euros at least. So it's difficult.
Let's have two more questions. One here, and then if there's anyone else who wants the last one, we'll come into the left. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Andrea Morelli, Mapei Sport. So we are looking at the problem of doping from the anti-doping point of view. If we think about the mentality of the riders inside the peloton, from Marco, what is your vision? They are changing the mentality, and from the point of view of the anti-doping, the riders are changing the mentality, because there seems there are some riders that have a distorted vision of sports, and they are the most oriented to cheat.
Thank you, Marco.
I think the riders have changed their mentality. They will keep this mentality as soon as the doping control will keep going. Because as soon as you stop the control, I think it's part of the human nature to try to cheat, and then if you keep in place a good doping anti-doping system, the rider has less perception of is less scared of what his competitors are doing. It's always the same thing. If I have the perception that my competitors are doing something wrong, then I look also for this because I want to play on a level playing field, like they say. But so my main worry is that as soon as you stop or to doing the control, or you do less, then in a couple of years you come back to the problem at the same level as before. That's why the funding is important, and keep the research in anti-doping is very important.
Mario? And then I also want to ask Michael, it's the same question actually. I'm curious to hear your perceptions about attitudes within the sport.
I think it's correct, Andrea. We have to contribute altogether to change this culture of doping within cycling. And I think what Marco said is absolutely correct. We have to keep up with a strong anti-doping program. But at the same time, for instance, at the UCI, we are working now with the Institute of Science of Sport of the University of Lausanne in order to try to define the environment within the team, how this, because we have seen that depending on the teams, how the rider is supervised, if there are no great, for instance, distinctions of roles between performance, between care, between other aspects, there might be more either possibility for others to cheat without being disclosed, or there will be less possibility for the team to be aware of the time when the athlete is in a fragile position and may be tempted to dope. But on the other side, I think things are also changing the mentality of the athlete. When we introduced the no-needle policy, we didn't have many problems with the team in applying that, because many team doctors were saying, it's especially the old school athletes which are requiring the injection. And many times they were saying we are doing placebo injection. And because we know that the injection of illicit substance has been, for many athletes, the first step into a doping program, when we introduced the rule, we clearly saw a change in this attitude. And I think nowadays, athletes and cyclists in particular are very reluctant towards injections. I mean, I have no way to prove it, but it's the feedback I have from the field. And so I would like to ask Marco, what is your opinion? I think in the end of the 90s, everyone was getting injection of something. Now the situation has changed.
Yeah, this is true, but I would say if a substance is like as effective as CPO tomorrow is on the market and is not detectable, there's no test for it. It's not that the older generation are bad, the new generation is good. I think this new substance will be used soon by all the athletes in the world if there is no test. So that's why it's important to to keep the testing.
Michael, your thoughts on this, and then we'll take this last question and wrap up.
The perception of the media and the perception that the media is driving in the fan base is always connected to the headlines. It's always connected to the last big story, which is why at the minute Lance Armstrong is still an enormously desired story. Even here, where we ought to have a kind of a more sophisticated grasp of it, he's still someone we keep coming back to because he's a headline. And that's produced a very high degree of cynicism, and you can spend a long time in the media trying to convince people that the perception of doping in the sport has changed, and that things like the biological passport, which in itself is difficult because it's hard to explain how that works in simple terms, how that has changed the way the sport works. It's difficult to get through the cynicism that exists in the fan base surrounding that, simply because in the media you chase headlines, you chase famous riders, you go looking for scandals, and you actually you can end up undermining the sport that you should be trying to defend. But the other issue that a lot of members of the media have is that historically they have ended up defending people who ultimately were cheating. And I think there are now a lot of members of the media who have been so badly burned by scandals like the Lance Armstrong scandal, even back to the Facina scandal, that where they should be defending the sport as hard as they can, sometimes they're not, because they're scared of being made to once again look like an idiot.
Last question.
So Dr. Zorzoli has essentially answered my question, which is a bit of an anticlimax. But it was around the emergence of no needles policies, and I was interested to hear your thoughts and comments as a panel on how much of those policies you think were motivated by a desire to change the culture, and how much of it was actually through some characteristics of needles as a delivery method with potential performance enhancing benefits. Could you ever see a time when maybe, in cases of extreme dehydration, for example, as we explored earlier today, there could be a reason to permit needles and infusions if the culture shifted sufficiently?
First of all, I will talk about it a little bit tomorrow. But nevertheless, the idea to introduce the no-needle policy came for several reasons. The fact that very often athletes were using it for substances which were not, where there were alternatives on non-injectable drugs, or for drugs which there were no medical indication for this drug to be injected. And so we try in a certain way just to put a framework to this kind of a medical act, similar to what exists for the therapeutic use exemption. So it's something which can be done if, first of all, there is a clear medical indication. So a doctor has to define that for this specific act there is a medical indication. There is no possible alternative, either because it does not exist or because it cannot be prescribed. If someone is really vomiting and it's not possible to give him oral drugs, it will be possible to give an injection. And it has to be prescribed following the indication of the drug, so we don't want off-label treatments. There are drugs which were used in cycling which were approved to be used in patients undergoing chemotherapy. And probably someone who is in the Tour de France is not in the same situation as someone who is in an oncology department. And finally, it has to be administered by the doctor. Nevertheless, when you talk about dehydration and things like that, this is something completely different because it is a prohibited method and it is dealt with the water list and the TUE. So clearly the no-needle rule does not apply to all the situations which are under the umbrella of the prohibited list and therefore the TUE, the therapeutic use exemption.
And that's to be continued tomorrow in your presentation. Very good. I think on that note, because it's now into that, I know we did start quite late, so we've made up a little bit of time, but I'm going to say thank you and then close off. And I think you'll join me in thanking, I think our speakers were very frank and open and were willing to discuss pretty much anything. I hope that it lit some new ideas for you. So join me in thanking them, please. Finally, I guess I was just the other day, well, I started reading a book, another one of the many books on cycling's past. This one by a journalist called Juliet McCurr called Cycle of Lies, in which she describes what happened in the period from 1999, 2000, 2001 in the sport post-Christina. And it struck me that many of the things that we are discussing and have heard today would have been discussed then also. Many of the same media articles that Michael referred to, where people were very defensive and defended, in that case it was Armstrong, are the same kinds of things that are being written today. So there's a real chance that we end up going around in circles in 15 years from now at the 17th World Cycling Science Congress. We have the same discussion. The only difference is how much we are willing to question what's going on without being cynical, and that's the balance that we need to find. So I think I'll leave it on that and say enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.